cultural images and expectations are being used in Thailand to construct oppressive structures within the political landscape. And while some may claim that these structures are merely manifestations or extensions of long-standing cultural norms, I believe that if we use the work of Anne Swidler, we can see that this is a case of culture in action, by which she means culture influences action not by providing the ultimate values towards which action is oriented, but by shaping a repertoire or a toolkit, she says, of habits, skills, and styles from which people, and in this case I'm really focusing in on elites, construct strategies of action. So in other words, elites are using culturally salient building blocks in order to fashion seemingly, and I put a little asterisk there, we can get back to seeing if it's been effective or not, but seemingly acceptable rules that suit their own particular goals. So culture, in other words, doesn't determine the form of governance, it's merely exploited by it and makes it possible. So whether we're looking at the term network monarchy by Duncan McCargo, or perhaps even the deep state, which observers like Eugenie Mériot tend to use, I think we can see that these elites possess only three of Michael Mann's sources of social power. They have political power, they have military power, and they have economic power, but what they lack is normative or ideological power. And in order to make up for that, as Gianfranco Poggi mentions, they're promiscuous about sharing those forms of power. And they look to the monarch as an institution, as a source of that legitimacy and the normative power. So in exchange, essentially, a bargain is struck. You lend us your ideological power, and we will use our political, military, and economic power to protect you. And that ideological power that comes from, in this case, the king, confers upon those other elements of the elites a patina of legitimacy, which helps to justify inequalities, for example, across society. And in so doing, in constructing this legitimacy, it uses traditional values as its toolkit. And really, when it's done correctly, it forms a bit of a virtuous circle. So it goes something like this, that the king has dharma or barami, he has legitimacy through a form of sacredness or near holiness, and those that serve and protect the king are able to get indirectly a piece of that holiness reflected upon themselves. That has a utility. Nobody wants to be seen as a naked capitalist or a naked military junta, for example. It's much better to be shrouded within the legitimacy of I do what I do in the name and for the purpose of protecting the king. But it's also useful to say, if you oppose me in what I'm doing, you must therefore also be opposing the king, who is, as I said, a near holy figure. And Christine Gray has done a very good job in her 1986 thesis looking at the soteriological aspects of sacredness and indirect merit within the Thai society. So we can see what has to happen here, though, which is quite interesting, I think, is that the institution of the monarchy needs to have this legitimacy given to it in the first place. So the fact that narratives are constructed and a public relations campaign, as it were, is made up to make sure that the king is always regarded as being holy, as being the fountain of legitimacy. The efforts made at legitimizing the king can then be essentially extracted and turned into legitimacy in this indirect manner. And I think that's not a particularly new approach to the issue. I do think, though, there are two developments that are occurring now that make this slightly different, and I'm only going to focus on one of them given the time, and that is to say that the current king is to a certain extent hijacking the process that in and of itself was a hijacked process. So let me be a little bit more clear there. Under the previous reign, the king went through, King Rama IX went through an evolution of legitimacy. Immediately following his coronation, immediately following the Second World War, the monarchy was not regarded in particularly high standing. It was an interesting kind of traditional hangover, but it had most of its land had been appropriated, most of its political power had been significantly neutered through the Thai nation building process, but also through Japanese occupation. After 1945, it was, well, we have this thing, but it doesn't really feature very, very strongly in Thai political culture. And indeed, the King Rama IX was effectively under house arrest for the early parts of his reign. He was tolerated. There would be news items about him playing tennis or boating or playing the saxophone, but he had no real role. He hadn't gone outside of Bangkok. He hadn't gone up country, as it were, to kind of meet his subjects. He was very much controlled because the strongmen of the day wanted the focus to be on their role. That changed in the late 1950s, partially due to an American realization that a strong, centralized national figure that had a traditional and somewhat mystical allure would be a useful antidote to communist insurgency in the north and in the south. So the process of reanimating the king was undertaken. And that really never ended with King Rama IX until his death. The amount of public relations, the amount of credit that was given to the king for charitable works, for inventions, for innovation in things like irrigation, cloud seeding, it was a constant process. To a very large extent, though, the king himself was absent from that process. He was an object of this process, an object of veneration, an object of legitimation, but was not often, although sometimes, personally involved. His interventions in politics were few and rare enough that when they did happen, they were very noteworthy, and they were very much seen, to mix metaphors, as the nuclear option. If the king had to intervene and scold politicians, for example, that was reserved for very large national crises. And it was very effective for what Duncan McCargo has called the network monarchy. They were able to exploit the legitimacy that had been invested in the king by taking up positions of foundation presidencies, privy council rules, etc. A very large piece of the legitimacy of the king stemmed from the myth that he was above politics and therefore beyond criticism. And again, the use of this, removing the king from the kind of worldly affairs, was very useful in the sense that no dissent could be brokered. The lèse majesté laws in Thailand are extremely harsh and were used very much to silence any criticism of the state, of any particular policy, because there was a way of connecting that back to the godhead or the king in and of itself. Now, I think what the new development is that the new king, King Rama the 10th, may or may not have, and I think it's less clear now than it perhaps was 3 or 4 years ago, he may or may not have the genuine adoration of the Thai people in the same way that his father did. However, he has used the legitimation process, the myths surrounding the holiness and sacredness of the institution of the king, to protect himself in a way, making him as the inheritor of King Rama IX's legacy also beyond reproach, beyond criticism. Now, certainly criticism does happen in private, but publicly it is still, not allowed to criticize the king. But what's been very interesting, though, I think, is that he has shifted from an object of veneration to an agent of his own legitimization, in the sense that he now has personalized rule and taken over some of those elements of extended power that the previous institution of the king lacked. So, for example, since his father's death, he has taken personal control of the Crown Property Bureau, essentially the assets of the monarch, around $30 billion that used to be held in trust and managed on his behalf. He now has that under his own personal control. Similarly, in the military realm, There were units that were designated as the king's bodyguard or the king's unit or the king's cavalry. He's now taken some of those under his own direct command. They're no longer under Ministry of Defense command. They report directly to him. So in some senses, where the old king only brought to bear one form of social power, that was legitimacy, and lacked economic, military, and political, this king is doing his very level best to not have to rely on others to provide himself directly with economic, military, and political power. To the extent that, and I'll just use one example, the number of lèse majesté cases have gone down, which people may see on one hand as being somewhat paradoxical, but what he's actually done is to say, you don't get to decide when I have been aggrieved. I will decide. So I don't want the state, I don't want the government, whether it's the junta or the newly elected government, making those kinds of decisions and scolding people on my behalf. I reserve that right in and of itself. And I think something that was brought up in the questions of an earlier iteration of this talk is the personal level of involvement the king has taken in very publicly running the royal household, the running of the palace. So firing and hirings that would normally be somewhat uninteresting have been elevated to, I think, an example of this king taking a personal role in being the king, rather than an object that is a useful but somewhat inert figure. And I'll end it there. Thanks very much. I look forward to your questions.